Well, good morning. I'm Chris Simonetti, a professor here at the Pontificia Universidad Católica, and Diana Espirito Santo, who is also a professor here at the Pontificia Universidad Católica. And we're here with Professor Tim Ingold from the University of Aberdeen, has been visiting us for the past week. Tim Ingold is chair of social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen, has carried out fieldwork among Sami and Finnish people in Lapland, has written on environment, technology and social organization in the Circumpolar North, on animals in human society, and on human ecology and evolutionary theory. His more recent work explores environmental perception and skilled practices. And Tim Ingold's current interests lie on the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art and architecture. He has written many books, some of which are here. It's a long career, running for over 40 years, I believe. But if we count from 2000, we have The Perception of the Environment, published in that same year. We also have Lines in 2007, Being Alive in 2011.
2008, I think.
2008, that's another collection that had also an important impact. And Making in 2013, and his most recent book, The Life of Lines. And since we are here in Chile, Santiago, we could perhaps, knowing this is a Spanish-speaking context, we could perhaps mention his most recent translation of Líneas in 2000, or Lines in 2007, now Líneas by Elisa. Well, it's perhaps one of the most influential British social anthropologists now, and perhaps one of the most widely read anthropologists in Britain, not just in anthropology but in many other disciplines, knowing his interdisciplinary interest. Outside anthropology is definitely a highly well-read anthropologist. So I thank you so much, Tim, for being here. It's a pleasure to have you among us and to have you in this interview. Diana will start with our first question.
Okay. Thank you, Tim, for being here with us. We really appreciate it. So my first question has to do with your trajectory from Cambridge to Manchester and from Manchester to Aberdeen. And so my proper question is, what's the role of your department, the department that you created in Aberdeen, in British anthropology, social anthropology, or social anthropology in general? And can you talk a little bit about the transition for you between Manchester and Aberdeen and what scope that gave you?
Okay. The move to Aberdeen in 1999 was for me a leap in the dark. I had been in Manchester for 25 years. And Aberdeen didn't at that time have an anthropology department. It had one or two anthropologists who were based in other places. And they had the idea in Aberdeen that they wanted a program focusing on the north because of Aberdeen's location. And it was to set out within a department of sociology. I decided to take up the challenge partly because if I didn't, I would have probably stayed in Manchester for the rest of my career, long past my sell-by date, getting in the way of younger colleagues who have their own particular agendas, and I didn't want to do that. So I took the leap, and I took it because I thought there would be a possibility to set up a new department, and those possibilities don't come very often. When I arrived, I found that different people had claimed to have had the idea that Aberdeen University needed anthropology. The principal of the university had formerly been principal of New York University, which had a very fine anthropology department, and thought that any proper university should have anthropology. The dean of the faculty was an economist, and he thought it would be a good thing. He thought it was his idea because I think it's the only idea he ever had. And then the head of the Department of Sociology thought it would be a way of getting more student numbers. They all had different ideas about what anthropology was for, but none of them really thought that I was going to set up a new department. But that was my hidden agenda. So we started with a particular interest in the anthropology of the North, which is my region, and within 3 years we had established our own department at the same time as the foundation of the School of Social Science. So to start off with, the department had this particular character of focusing on northern peoples and was quite unique in that respect. No other anthropology department in Britain had that kind of northern focus. The Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge had some anthropologists working in that area, but that was not in itself an anthropology department. And then we grew and grew, and you can't actually tie a department to one particular regional interest. That's not healthy, so we developed other interests as the department grew, particularly maybe focusing on my kinds of interests in environmental perception, in creativity and in making, but now we also have interests in ritual and religion and politics because of new appointments. But I still think that the department has got a particular character. We don't have, it's not a school, we don't have kind of Aberdeen School of Anthropology, but I think there's something in the air that whenever we have visitors come to the department, they always notice. I think perhaps about an experimental way of doing things. It's a young department. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but there's certainly an openness, an experimentality, thinking about new ways of doing anthropology beyond the kind of standard model of just doing ethnographic fieldwork and writing it up that we've been experimenting with. Mm-hmm. And I think it gives it a special character.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tim. You just mentioned your work on perception. And from your, one of the earliest books we have here is The Perception of the Environment. And in your most recent books or works, you have been exploring imagination. And it would be nice if you could tell us a bit about this transition.
Well, yes. A number of colleagues pointed out to me who'd looked at the perception of the environment. They said, this is all very nice, your theory of perception, but where do you put imagination into it? Because in the perception of the environment, particularly because I was particularly influenced by people like Gibson, for example, and Gibson in his ecological psychology really doesn't want to have any kind of division between humans and non-human animals. He just wants to talk about animals, actually most of the time, or organisms perceiving their environment, and he doesn't care whether they're human or non-human. And so I was building up a theory of perception as far as possible, trying to break down the boundary between human and non-human, which is all very well until you say, but then human beings, maybe animals too, but we know that human beings imagine things, they dream, they tell stories. And the question was, where was I going to put that in the theory? And I had to admit that I didn't have a place for imagination in the sort of theory of direct perception that I was developing there. So that's the next thing. I said, it's just I have to, having dealt with perception, I now have to see if I can find a way of understanding the relationship between perception and imagination, and that's what I'm working on now, because it's definitely missing from the perception of the environment.
And you talk a little bit about experimentation in Aberdeen, which we can see, of course, in your most recent work. And it would be nice if you could tell us about the relationship, or the relationship you have been establishing with other fields. I'm thinking of art, design, architecture. And perhaps if you could tell us a bit more about what's the role of experimentation for anthropology and archaeology.
Okay. This all has to do with the problem, which is rather central to me, about the relationship between anthropology and ethnography. And we actually have tensions in the department about this. There are some people some colleagues who feel very strongly that anthropology is fundamentally an ethnographic enterprise, and that's what you should be doing. And if you're not doing ethnography, then you're not doing proper anthropology. And then we have others who are arguing for a much more experimental sort of approach, which is the approach I would take, which is to say that ethnography is fine, but that's just one way of doing anthropology. And if anthropology is an essentially speculative inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of human life in the world, then there are all sorts of ways of doing it. And for example, archaeology is one way of doing it. And one of my reasons why I don't like the collapsing of the distinction between anthropology and ethnography is that it excludes archaeology. It's telling the archaeologists you can't do anthropology, you can't address anthropological questions because you don't do ethnography, and that seems to me ridiculous. So we got to allow that archaeology, the practice of archaeology, excavation, working in landscapes and so on, that's a possible way of doing anthropology. Ethnography is another way. And then there might be other ways as well. And these would include design and art, or various kinds of art practice, including performative kinds of practice, and even architecture. They're all possible ways of exploring how human beings imagine, perceive, create, move around in, transform the environments, the worlds that they inhabit. And I would like to see an anthropology that is open to all these kinds of speculative possibilities. And the really important thing is that for me anthropology is a speculative discipline. It's not experimental in the natural scientific sense that you're setting up experiments based on hypotheses and then testing them by gathering data, but it is experimental in the sense that it is speculative, and you can put interventions in the world, you can do things and see what happens, which is what artists do, what architects do, what designers do.
Thank you. Well, I'm taking 2 or 3 questions, and then we will go back to Diana with more questions. And I have another question related to what you just said, and it's very, very powerful the way you describe the changes by bringing this new relation with other disciplines that create in the world or are meant to design, intervene in the world, how it changes anthropology. And I wonder about this more recent work you have been doing on pedagogy and education, and how that relates to experimentation.
This is where I'm at now. I'm just education is the latest of this many disciplines that I've bumped into and discovered, and realised that I want to go forward with them. And in fact, this summer I plan to write a little book on anthropology and as education, which is based on some lectures I presented in France in February. And it has only just recently dawned on me, I think within the last couple of years perhaps, that anthropology is fundamentally an educational discipline, and so I've been arguing now that the ultimate goal of anthropology is not ethnographic but educational, but it's educational in a very specific sense, and that's not the sense in which education is normally understood within the standard model of school and university education. It's not in that pedagogic sense of transmitting knowledge or developing minds or turning ignorant students into knowledgeable adults. It's not that at all. And the key, the thing that really opened my eyes to this was a chance encounter I had with a Belgian philosopher of education called Jan Maschelijn, who's becoming increasingly known now, but not very well known yet. And I bumped into him at a festival of walking in Belgium, actually, because he's interested in walking too, and I was, and I heard him give this presentation, and I immediately sat up. I thought, this is something special. And Maschelijn was simply arguing that there are 2 senses of education, or 2 etymological derivations. One of them is educare, which is to instill knowledge into ignorant minds. The other one is ex docere, which means literally to lead out. And Maschlein was exploring this idea of education as a process of leading people out into a world. And he calls it exposure, of taking people out of position, not about taking up particular positions or points of view, but of leading people out of them, and in that way allowing them to have a direct experience of presence of the world as it actually is. So he said, how can we get people out of this endless reflections of mirrors on mirrors and mirrors and mirrors when everything is a representation? We need to get people out of that hall of mirrors and into the world, and the way to do that is through leading people out into the world in that form of education. And I suddenly realized that is what anthropology is all about. It's all about pulling people out of their normal position. It's when we talk about participant observation, that's what we're doing. And so I realized that education in that sense is fundamental to the practice of anthropology as something that is transformative for the people who do it, and then subsequently transformative for students who are influenced by anthropologists who've done their work here or there. And it seems to me that should be that transformational purpose must be the fundamental purpose of anthropology. So I want to argue that anthropology that the goal of anthropology is not ethnography but education. So that's where I am now, and I'm going to write it up over the summer.
Is that a coming book?
That will be a book that I hope to get finished by autumn this year. So it will come out maybe a year from now.
And do you have a professional title for it?
It's Anthropology /as Education.
Is there an experimental aspect to this book? I mean, are people actually doing it?
There would be experimental aspect to it insofar as it might suggest different ways of teaching anthropology, which challenge standard models of pedagogy in higher education, very definitely, yes. To some extent it grows out of the making book. I mean, the making book grew out of a course that I taught called the 4As, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art and Architecture, and some of the principles of education that I was trying out in that course was, to some extent, an experiment along the same lines. How could you teach students to be good observers? So in that sense, grew out of that.
Okay, the next question takes a complete right angle to what you've just explained. So I would like to know where your ecological approach, or ecology of materials approach, sits in relation to the ontological turn, which I think is a very sort of contemporary, very flashy and approach to anthropology, which a lot of people are taking. And whether there are any possible connections between the two approaches. And my feeling is that there probably are, but I can't quite put my finger on it.
Okay. The first thing I'd say is that I'm not a fan of the ontological turn, but maybe for two reasons. I mean, one reason is that I'm not a fan of turns in general. I think that this idea of turn, everybody's trying to figure out, there are so many turns. There's been a material turn, there's been goodness knows how many turns. And it seems to me that this is largely a branding exercise by ambitious young scholars who like to be identified with having done the turn and introduced it. And I can't see any use in that, really. And the second reason, which I suppose is related to that, is that I think that there is very little new about it. That if you go back to what anthropologists were doing and talking about a long time ago, you'll find they were already saying everything that the ontological turners are saying now, perhaps using different words, but essentially saying the same thing. In the what I did do in my work is to try and critique the object-centered approach of traditional material culture studies. So I wrote an article in 2007 called Materials Against Materiality, which was trying to bring materials back in. And some people tell me that that's to do with the material turn. But again, I don't know whether this is material turn or not material turn. But I certainly wanted to bring materials back in, and I wanted to bring processes of growth back in, to see making, doing as processes of becoming, processes of growth. So the kind of turn I want, if we're going to have a turn at all, is not so much ontological as ontogenetic. I want an ontogenetic turn because I'm interested in not philosophies of being, but generations of being. How ways of being actually become. For example, children have. If one talks about, for example, different sorts of ontology, an animistic ontology here or a naturalistic one there, you think, how is it that children become animists, or how is it that they become naturalists? How does that happen? Something must be going on. Mm-hmm. So part of the reason why I'm against the ontological is that I think it entails an overemphasis on the shapes of mature thought, forgetting all about the fact that people actually have to be doing their thinking and they never arrive at a final position on anything. So I would want to have an ontogenetic approach which links together the movements of people's attention, the growth of their awareness, and the movements of materials, and seeing how the movements of materials and the movements of consciousness, awareness and attention move along together and generate forms of understanding. So that's a processual model, and I much prefer that to the various versions of the ontological. The philosopher who really introduced that ontogenetic approach is Gilbert Simondon, who is writing in French and is still not properly translated, bits and pieces translated, but he's not properly translated into English. Simondon was a great influence for Deleuze, and people are picking up a lot of their ideas from Deleuze. But I think we should go back to Simondon. And he called it individuation, but it's the same idea.
In connection with what you're saying, I'm a fan, more or less, of the ontological turn. I was Martin Holbrook's PhD student, and it allows me to speak of my own work with spirit possession in Cuba in a way that's not reductive. So in this ecological turn on your approach, how can we think of the spiritual dimension of social life? How can we really how can we take beliefs in extraordinary entities and events seriously without reducing them to just matter? Can we take transcendence in any way seriously?
Of course, it comes back to this question about imagination that we were talking about earlier. I don't think it helps to try and. Martin's approach would be to say that to collapse the distinction between concepts and things. Yeah. And so they say, well, it's one and the same. And what I think that leaves out is process. I want to. For one thing, I don't think we need concepts. I'd be very happy to get rid of the whole idea of concepts, and instead talk about generative movements of life, and I would be happy to talk about imagination. Imagination is really a bad word because it has this word image inside it and it takes us in the wrong direction. But what I want to talk about is an impulse of life by which, the way I put it, it's a bit in this Life of Lines book, that I'm trying to think of life as something that is caught in a tension between an imagination, or whatever you want to call it, that is forging ahead, and a friction that comes from our engagement with material stuff, which is pulling us behind. And the way I put it there is that life is lived in this tension, between the pulling ahead and the friction that's holding back. That's not a tension between belief and objects. It's a tension between the forward momentum of life and the friction of its material engagements. And that's the way I want to put it. It's in a way it's like taking that axis belief thing and turning it on its side so it becomes temporal. And it's the temporal dimension of becoming that I think is missing from Martin's work.
Mm-hmm. You may have already answered this, but I'll ask it anyway, just in case. So within the material turn, which is not a term that you're particularly fond of, at least among theorists of material culture, there has been an emphasis on the redistribution of agency through things, people, non-people, non-existent things, invisible things, visible things. And our question is, how do you understand the notion of the agency of things?
I hate it. The idea that things have agency seems to me to be a complete nonsense, and has given rise to a huge amount of pointless going around in circles. I would rather. My own view has been that let's use this concept of agency as little as possible, and instead talk about life. But if we're going to talk about agency, then let us say that agency is inside action, not that agency is the cause of action. And I think that the biggest mistake in a lot, not all, but in a lot of the literature on agency, is that it sees things going on in the world and says, well, if something's going on, that must be the effect of a cause. So let's invent agency as the cause of this effect. And if we can't find the cause, well, we'll just talk about agentive effects. Now, this seems to me to be completely circular in exactly the same way that in the bad old days, 50 years ago, when it was all about functionalism, then in those days people said, the functionalists, that everything in the world is there because it has a function. It does something, and whatever it does allows the world to persist in the particular way that it does. And critics of functionalism quite rightly said, this is ridiculous, because to say something functions is simply to say that it exists. Because if it didn't function, it wouldn't be there. And it seems to me that agency talk is caught in exactly the same circularity. Something is there, by virtue of its presence, it has an effect. If it wasn't there, things would be different. So they say, oh, therefore this thing must have agency, because if it didn't, that effect wouldn't be there. It's completely circular. So we can simply ditch the whole thing about cause and effect and simply say presence. There it is. And then we can see, we could start with action. We can start with movement, with things going on in the world, and accept that movement, process, and action are the primary terms. They're not secondary derivatives of something else. We don't have to have agency. We don't have to put the noun before the verb. So everything I've been writing just now, Life of Lines and some other things, is focusing on what happens if you start with verbs rather than with objects and subjects. It's a kind of grammatical inversion. Then the problem of agency just disappears. Simple. And all these philosophers look just a bit stupid. I think some are a bit stupid. When you get literature on whether cat flaps have agency, what on earth? Anyway.
Following on that thing, thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about this. Of course, we will have it this evening. A talk you're giving here at the Universidad Católica, titled One World Anthropology. And I think it's a challenge that relates to all we have been discussing so far with regards to agency, yes. Things and concepts, the ontological term.
It is.
So
you asking me to tell you in advance,
so that other people can benefit from some glimpses of your talk this evening.
So okay, some glimpses. Well, but as the title suggests, I want to argue that anthropology, it's important that anthropology remain, it's important politically, ethically and intellectually that anthropology remains committed to the principle that there is one world. And I think that it's now become very popular to talk about multiple worlds of this and that. It used to be multiple worlds of culture, now it's multiple worlds of being, if you're an ontological turnist, whatever. But it's fashionable to talk about multiplicity all the time. And I think that's politically, ethically and intellectually indefensible, and that we must understand our co-participation in one world. So that's the fundamental message of it. But at the same time, of course, I've got to challenge conventional corporate one world notions. This isn't the one world according to British Airways or according to AstraZeneca or anything like, or the World Bank. It's completely against that. It's a one world of infinite differentiation, and it comes back to this distinction between ontology and ontogenesis that we were talking about earlier. Because if everything is its own world, then with some versions of the ontological turn, you've got as many worlds as there are things. Everything is its own world. There it is. Particularly if you're an object-oriented ontologist, one of those is that, this is its own, there's a world here, and a cup, and a table, and everything. And all these different worlds that are sunk inexorably into themselves. I mean, not everybody takes that line, but that's one view that's fashionable at the moment, and I think that's very, very wrong. But if you focus on ontogenesis, then everything there is, that you recognise as a thing, is a particular place, a particular moment of emergent differentiation. And then you can understand the world itself in terms of field properties. You can think of the world, in fact, as many modern cosmologists do, as basically a field, an evolving field, in which nodes and knots appear sometimes to move along, and each of those is what we might recognise as a thing or a person or a bit of landscape or whatever that we're interested in. So I want to show that by focusing on ontogenesis by focusing on the ontogenetic rather than the ontological, we can recognise difference and unity at the same time. And this is an approach that William James, back in 1908, I think, in a series of lectures at Oxford, called it, he wrote up the lectures and called it a plural universe, or in the lectures he called it sometimes abbreviated it to a multiverse. And in fact, he was anticipating most of the ideas of kind of the Deleuzean rhizome and everything else. He was saying all that 100 years, not quite 100 years previously, in terms of a world that wherever you are in it, you can go somewhere else. You can be at a particular place, and from there you can get to here or there or wherever else you want to go. It's infinitely extending, infinitely unfolding. But it is nevertheless this pluriverse. It's one verse. It's not lots and lots of different ones. Basically, that's all I'm arguing for. But there's a complication in the argument, which all hinges on the distinction between and with. And is conjunctive, and with is prepositional. And I want to argue for withness as against andness, which is something that all the rhizome people tend to gloss over under their catch-all concept of the assemblage that we were talking about yesterday, and where I think the distinction is absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you, Tim. Connected to what we're discussing here, I wanted to ask you about your most recent book. I know it's a continuation from the previous lines. I know you always had in mind this most recent book after you finished this one, and perhaps if we could focus a little bit on how lines allow us to understand the traditional object of study of anthropology, sociality, or in general.
Well, it really stands for a process model or a process ontology. Mm-hmm. But in the first lines book, because of the way I structured it, I wanted to set up a contrast between two kinds of lines, one being the process trace of a movement, the other being what I call the point-to-point connector. That's the Euclidean line. You have A, you have B, you connect them up. And I wanted to show basically that in modernity the movement gave way to the point-to-point connector, which is why when you talk about lines nowadays, most people immediately start thinking about A to B connections, or they assume the line to be straight, and then you have to point out that, well, no, lines can be bendy, curved, and go any way you like. So that book concentrated very much on that distinction, and how historically, in a number of different fields, in writing, in music, in transport, in mapping, there was a sort of a transition historically from one to the other, which is basically a movement towards modernity. In this book, I forget about the point-to-point connector altogether, as I've done that. In this book, lines are simply lines of process, lines of movement that we trace in life, and I want to start from the premise that a human being, for example, it goes back to this idea I mentioned a moment ago, that we need to start from the verb rather than the subject and the object. If you start from the human as a verb, then, and you want to describe a human, you would describe it as a line. The verb, in a way, the graphic form of the verb is a line. It's not a point, it's not a circle, it's not a blob. So I start the book with a contrast between blobs and lines, and then follow it on from there, looking at, there are the three parts: there's knotting, weathering, and humaning. But in every case, it's the verbal or the gerund form, as in putting the ing at the end of the word. Yes, that's what it's trying to do, and I decided when I did it, it's got lots and lots of short chapters, 30 very short chapters in it, and I actually one morning at breakfast I scribbled down all the chapters in my notebook, and there it was, just sort of came like that, and more or less kept to that. But I thought I would start from very classical anthropological themes, which were Durkheim, Mose on the gift, social solidarity. I really can't get more classical than that. Then go off into all kinds of places where anthropologists wouldn't normally dare to tread at all, and eventually circle back and show, having gone all over this place, we can get back to kinship, economy, politics, religion, and law, and completely recast all those questions. So it has that sort of arc form, and people might think that in the middle of it, this has got nothing to do with anthropology, because it goes into architecture and stuff. But my strategy was to start with the classical stuff, go up there, and then come back and show how you can start with kinship, for example. Having been through all this stuff on lines, kinship looks completely different. And you can get back to classical themes about the axiom of amity, what does it mean to love your kinsman, what's the difference in kinship and affinity, and look at them all over again. That was the idea.
And I think this is our last question. The question is the following. So I know that you've been meeting in the last few days with archaeologists and anthropologists and people here at the Catholic University, and on a project funded by the British Academy. Could you tell us a little bit about that project, Solid Foods, and what you hope to achieve with that project?
Well, this is for both Chris and myself. We're equal partners in this plot, the grant comes. It's not a very big grant. It's about £26,000, and it's under a scheme that the British Academy calls International Partnership and Mobility. And what they're really looking for is not simply a research project. They're looking for the development of new initiatives in countries, other countries linked to Britain, and in this case the country is Chile. New initiatives in both teaching and research, and so they want to see, as a result of this, people in the partner country coming together in new ways, talking about things they wouldn't otherwise be talking about. And they want it to have an effect on students and teaching as well. So clearly part of what we want to achieve is some kind of impetus in developing new ideas and new thinking among Chilean colleagues, and hopefully then some exchanges and links with colleagues in the UK. But it's linked to the idea of the Anthropocene. We are, I think both Chris and I, sort of semi-skeptical about this notion. It has its problems, which are well known, but it also has the great advantage of bringing people together in new disciplinary formations, discussing things that perhaps were not so much discussed before, and particularly between the geosciences and the social sciences. And so we see it as part of that. And we are particularly concerned with the way in which Anthropocene thinking breaks down traditional distinctions, if we can call it that, between solidity and fluidity on the one hand, and between short-term and long-term cycles of time on the other. Both of those distinctions begin to get collapsed. And we're particularly interested in forms of solid fluids, or materials that move back and forth between those states, with ice and concrete. And the reason for that is that in standard accounts of human history and prehistory, it always seems to start with the ice. Paleolithic starts at with the Ice Age hunters and the rest of it. And so when we think of ice, we think of a sort of primordial nature where history was kind of just about to begin. And when we think of concrete, we think of the world of global modernity and the end of it. And of course, that's so you think of the beginning of history and the end of history, and with ice at one end and concrete at the other. And clearly, if one collapses these hard, soft, and long-term, short-term distinctions, and you think in an Anthropocenic kind of way, one of the effects of that is to disrupt the normal periodizations of history. And so instead of having this layer and that layer and that layer and that layer and that layer going from the Stone Age to modernity, everything seems to shift 90 degrees and moving along. And so you can begin to think of ice as something that has coursed through history, and concrete too as something that is coursed through history, and along with all sorts of other materials. And then you can start looking at how those materials correspond or move along with one another, and what sorts of processes that generates. And that's more or less what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.
I just wanted to briefly thank you once again for coming all this way and accept our invitation for this interview. And I will really, we're very appreciative of the time, and I would like to briefly thank our sponsors, the British Academy, la Vicerrectoría Académica here in La Católica, and ICIS, the Interdisciplinary Center for Intercultural Studies, all of whom have contributed to fund your visit.
And I would like to thank you too for your hospitality.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.